architecture, urban planning, and Africology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is now studying architecture and urban planning at Columbia University. Go Teonna. Her work bridges the gap between city planning, design, and grassroots organizing. She focuses on environmental justice using an equity lens and questions how we can design better, more equitable environments that generate wealth within Black and Brown communities. Do you want to just say hello quick, Teonna?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
All right, and Adrianna, if you want to give a quick wave, well, I see you there. She is currently a brand consultant for Step Up Equity Matters, an organization focused on creating innovative and engaging learning experiences that produce inclusive, equitable, and diverse workplaces. She is the recent transplant to Madison, Wisconsin after 10 plus years in New York City, living and working in design and marketing. She is also the creator of the anti-racism learning resource, Your Black Friends Are Busy. Do you want to say a quick hello?
Hey, everybody. Excited and nervous to be here. I'm not a public speaker by nature, so go with the flow.
We have this virtual lens tonight, so. All right, I'm going to pass the mic back to you, Therese.
Great, thanks, Melinda. Just real quick, the format for tonight, we're going to start by, we're going to pick our panelists' brains a little bit about this built exclusion issue that the panelists centered around. Milwaukee has gained infamy for being one of the most segregated cities in America. And so tonight we want to discuss the past actions which formed our neighborhoods. And we're also going to discuss a little bit about what those actions mean for people living there today. And then finally, we want to talk a little bit about what can be done in the future to make change. And so to do so, we're going to break into some small groups for 15 minutes. We'll kind of randomly assign you to some breakout groups. And you'll have 15 minutes to kind of have a little bit of a discussion about what you heard. And we'll offer some discussion prompts at that time too. We obviously miss the camaraderie of our in-person events, so please feel free to use your chat feature so that you can sort of private message each other, say hello. There's a drop down where you can select who you'd like to send the message to. If you'd like to ask a question of our panelists, we'll try to save some question time at the very end. So you can certainly direct questions to the everyone section in your chat so that all the moderators can see it, and we'll be able to prompt our panelists at the very end. Okay, well, let's just jump right into it with our first question. And this question is for Kacie, but of course, we always, as we go, all of our panelists are more than welcome to offer thoughts as we go. So Kacie, as we mentioned, Milwaukee has gained notoriety recently for topping the list of most segregated cities in America. And that segregation takes root in the historical practice of redlining. Can you help us understand a little bit about what redlining entailed?
Yes, definitely. Melinda, are you going to put up the PowerPoint? I'll just start, and then eventually Melinda's going to put up a PowerPoint with an example of some redlining text that I think is important. So, you know, to really, I think, begin to understand redlining, you have to start by looking at the history of housing. So I think today housing and home ownership are really synonymous with the American dream, but that wasn't always the case. So prior to 1920, mortgages looked very different than they do today. Buyers were expected to pay half of the value of their homes up front, and the other half was due within 5 years. So I don't know if any of you can think to your mortgages. Would you be able to pay half today and half in 5 years? Probably not. So most Americans couldn't meet these terms. And then the Great Depression happened, and it was a major blow to the real estate industry. The global economy collapsed and foreclosures skyrocketed. And so increasing home ownership was a critical component of the New Deal. So one of this series of federal programs designed to kind of bolster the economy was the 1933 Homeowners Loan Act, which offered federally backed mortgages. And this introduced the 15-year mortgage. And so this singular program really made homeownership so much more accessible in the US. But it's really important to note that these federally backed mortgages were expressly created for white people. Federal bureaucrats, politicians, bankers, and realtors, they worked together to keep people of color from getting these mortgages and from being able to buy housing. So less than 1% of all mortgages issued in the US between 1930 and 1960 were issued to African Americans, less than 1%. And the kind of thinking behind this was that they believed African Americans were poor credit risks and a threat to property values, and so they worked to keep neighborhoods entirely white. The main kind of component of this action is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which created color-coded maps for 239 cities, so what we call redlining maps. And appraisers were hired to canvass neighborhoods and report back on conditions. And so these canvassers were often local real estate professionals, and they were hired because they were so familiar with the area. And they were given a manual, and the manual was pretty clear about how these ratings were derived. So a quote from the manual, quote, "If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes." So the most desirable score, green or best, required racially restrictive covenants to be in place, and I will talk about covenants in a second. And the presence of people of color resulted in an immediate hazardous score. So if an area was redlined or deemed hazardous, the government would not back mortgages there. So you would have had to pay old mortgage terms, which is half up front, the rest in 5 years. So as a result, only white people could get these federally backed mortgages. Redline neighborhoods were just simply considered too risky for lenders. So loans for minorities in these neighborhoods were unavailable or prohibitively expensive. And so this really drained whatever capital was left in these few neighborhoods where people of color could really live. So I'm including 2 examples in this presentation. Both of them are from Milwaukee. But I wanted to say that all of the 230 redlining maps are available online at mappinginequality.com. So there's 2 things. Wherever you're located today, I would first encourage you to understand whose native land you are occupying. And second, to look at these local redlining maps and really to understand all of this in your local context, whatever your neighborhood is. So this first example is a pretty well-known area if you're familiar with Milwaukee. It encompasses Shorewood and Whitefish Bay. And as you can see, it received the highest score possible, a green rating, which means it most certainly had racial covenants in place. And I wanted to pull out these descriptions because I think it's really important to see how these neighborhoods were discussed. So these descriptions were instrumental in deciding the rating of the neighborhood. So here you can see they comment on the quote, better and more expensive construction, which is where architecture comes into play. Many of the homes in Shorewood and Whitefish Bay are architect design housing. So that was a critical component of the rating. You also see low property taxes, it's picturesque landscape, it's beauty. And then, you know, you also see that it will undoubtedly continue to be the choice for people. And I think that that one's kind of interesting, just knowing what Shorewood and Whitefish Bay are like today. But I also think one of the things is many Green Line neighborhoods have extensive notes to this effect, not only lauding the character of the white residents, but really describing in detail why they thought these neighborhoods were better. So I just want to warn you, the next slide deals with a redline neighborhood and the language is a little disturbing, but I do think that it's really important for us to look at it. So next slide, but just to warn you, the language is a little disturbing. So in this one, I chose a redline neighborhood, and this is what is considered Bronzeville, which is a historic Black neighborhood in North Milwaukee. So the area just north of downtown was described as, quote, a Negro and slum area of Milwaukee, old and ragged, and it also comments on the population of Jewish residents, particularly Russian Jews. And it also makes note to mention that it used to be a nice area 70 years ago. And a couple things are important here. First, the mention that it used to be a nice area was expressly used to condemn current residents and to blame them for the conditions in the neighborhood. And you often see this in redlining maps. The implication is that it used to be nice until the neighborhood demographics shifted. However, it really fails to account for the city's willful neglect of these neighborhoods, expressly because of their racial and religious makeup. And so it shifts the power of blame onto the residents themselves and obscures a lot of the power practices that are happening behind the scenes. And I pulled this one out as well because I think it's important to note that redlining was also a practice of religious discrimination, and Jewish people really bore the brunt of that discrimination in the Midwest. And lastly, it's important to go back to the manual of the HLC to understand that this neighborhood, even if it was nice, could have never gotten a green or a blue score because it had a population that was 65% Black and 25% Jewish. Neighborhoods with mixed race populations and with people who came from different classes, so i.e. working class and middle class, were expressly barred from these high ratings. There was literally 0% chance that they would ever get a high rating. And so it really becomes clear then that racial segregation and protecting white property values are the true goals of redlining. But redlining doesn't happen in a vacuum. One of the other important components to redlining, and one of the most powerful components of racial segregation, is called a racial deed restriction. It's also known as a racial covenant, and it barred people who were not white from owning or occupying property. So these two things went hand in hand. Historically, cities weren't actually very segregated. So there's this common kind of misbelief that people want to live next to people of their same race, but that data actually never bears out in any real way. Most cities prior to redlining had pretty racially diverse neighborhoods. And it's after the first racially restricted covenants start to appear in around 1910 that you really see this change in the landscape. So it is important to note covenants precede redlining by like 20, 25 years in some cities. So covenants were actually encouraged by the federal government and became a standard practice in the 1930s. The Federal Housing Administration called covenants, quote, the surest protection against undesirable encroachment of, quote, inharmonious racial groups. And so large sections of most major cities are covered in racial covenants. So if you go to the next slide, I included an example of a racial covenant. And this one's just for the record, it's from Minneapolis because that's where I have the most experience, but I guarantee you that these are in Milwaukee as well. So covenants weren't expressly created for racial restrictions. They actually arose out of this desire to make cities more inhabitable by improving plumbing, air quality, and living conditions. So at the time, you have to remember that cities are pretty gross, right? Like there's fire hazards, people don't have access to clean air, you're stepping over human waste in the streets. And so all of this rises out of let's make cities cleaner and safer. And so you can see this in some of the language, no noxious or offensive trades, no shacks, no livestock. But then you can also see on bullet point E just kind of snuck in there, no person of any race but the Aryan race can own or occupy this property unless they are domestic servants. So many people don't know that these covenants still exist on their home deeds, even though they're legally unenforceable. So when you buy a house, they send you the deed, they tell you not to lose it, and then you put it somewhere in like a box or a drawer. Chances are that if you live in like a historically white neighborhood, you have a racial covenant on your deed. And at the center of racial covenants is really this idea of who you can categorize on who is white and who is not. And whiteness is this constant shifting demographic in the US. And I think, you know, anybody who kind of does critical race theory or who understands American history will see the most clear example of this is in Irish and Italian immigrants who upon arrival to the US were not considered white, but are largely considered white today. And so the same question of who is considered white becomes extremely complicated when we get into covenants. In this covenants, it's clear that they say the Aryan race. Though as a historian, I just have to say that historians don't believe that the Aryan race actually exists. It's a white supremacist complex. But in other deeds, they would list exactly who they were planning to bar from living in these houses. So they would list every non-race that they could possibly think of. So for example, another one would say no Turkish people, no Ottoman people, no Black people, no Hispanic people, or anyone except the Aryan race. And so it really highlights that there's this broad swath of racial fears at the time. And it's useful for us as historians because we get to see who's being blatantly targeted here. But it also really highlights this kind of underlying question of what is whiteness and where do we see it? So all of these two efforts, redlining and racial covenants, really go together to racially segregate our cities. And the echoes of that we're still seeing today.
Thanks, Kacie. It really is sort of jarring to see that one you've highlighted about no persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy this building or any lot in the same list that it's dictating how high your fence should be and where your fence needs to be located. You know, something else that's notable on the maps that you were showing, I think has something to do with boundaries and barriers. So the urban renewal in Milwaukee saw the construction of new highway systems, which leveled Black neighborhoods. Can you talk a little bit to the effect that the barriers have on those communities?
Yeah, definitely. And if you want to go to the next slide, Melinda, I have like a little map. So while some people really understand, I think, the effects of housing discrimination, many people don't really see the way that highways kind of furthered this cause. And honestly, in many ways, they were like the natural product of redlining because they created spaces in the city that were seen as less than or undesirable and therefore worthy of being destructed. And it's important to note that it's not just highways, right? There are many urban renewal plannings, whether it's for creating spaces downtown for department stores and office buildings, or whether it's highways where you see large swaths of the city being razed, and those people notably are not being given another spot in the city to live. They're not being provided for. It's simply, we're going to buy your house, or we're going to raise this building that you live in, and then you're going to go somewhere else. And cities weren't really concerned with where that other place was. But highway construction was particularly damaging. So I think many people know the loose outlines, but real quick, President Eisenhower, he visited Europe and he was blown away by the Autobahn, and he wanted a similar thing in the US. And we were in the Cold War at the time. So he really envisioned the highway system as a way to quickly get troops into a city and to quickly evacuate populations in case there was an atomic attack. And so the Federal Highway Act of 1956 was passed. Most people were pretty pleased at the beginning, and then construction started. And once people saw the kind of destruction and the disruption, there's this whole period called the Highway Revolt period, where cities across the US, white and black, start protesting and revolting against these highways being built in their neighborhoods. And there were many of these protests in Milwaukee and in Madison and in Minneapolis and many Midwestern cities. So I've included this side-by-side image here of Milwaukee, and I highlighted Highway 43. So you kind of have to go back in time and you have to imagine a world without highways. And then you have to think about all the vast space that they take up. So where would you put 1? Where would you put 3? Where would you put 4 or 5? Cities immediately turned to redlining maps to understand what neighborhoods were undesirable, and that's where they built highways. And you can see that very clearly on this map. Milwaukee, I think, is further complicated by the river, which creates this natural barrier between the wealthy lakeside and between the Black communities that have been facing decades of disinvestment. And many of these highways split communities in half. So it's not only that they went through redline neighborhoods and through Black neighborhoods, they almost always expressly went through a Black neighborhood that had a lot of wealth. And so it was really a purposeful way to eliminate wealth in Black neighborhoods. That is certainly true in Minneapolis, where Highway 94 went through the historic Rondo neighborhood, which was considered one of the wealthiest Black neighborhoods in the US when it was destroyed. The same thing is true in Milwaukee. So the image I included in the upper right shows, I mean, a vibrant street full of brand new cars, brand new businesses. All of that was destroyed for this highway. So these neighborhoods not only were split as a community, but it also wiped out a lot of the vast wealth that was being made in these communities. So then not only do you have redlining and you have racial covenants that push people of color into smaller and smaller segments of the city where they're unable to buy housing unless they go through these kind of risky high-priced mortgages. They're unable to buy businesses in the same way. And then you have highway construction, which comes through. So even if they had somehow risen above and found a way to buy a house or buy a business, then the government comes through and ruins it with a highway. And so when you really kind of start to understand that these systems, then these things that we take as kind of natural, right? Oh, well, highways are there because that's where highways go, really aren't natural at all. These were decisions made by people, and this is intentional design meant to first racially segregate and then to wipe out this kind of generational wealth.
Thanks, Kacie. These maps have been really helpful. Thanks for doing the overlay of where our highway systems went through. We're gonna keep moving and talk a little bit. We're gonna engage Teonna next. And Teonna, so I think it's been really helpful for Kacie to have outlined for us some of these historical practices. So then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed to try to counteract some of what we've been hearing happened historically, but segregation was still reinforced. Could you talk a little bit about how that still occurred?
Yes, and thank you, Kacie, for just beautifully explaining how everything kind of worked together, because that's definitely going to help me to kind of explain the concept of block busting, which is a practice that real estate agents had where they would only showcase certain houses to certain people, depending on what race you were. And if you were Black, you weren't going to get shown any houses that were nice quality in white neighborhoods, even if you could afford it or not, because that's not where you were supposed to live. So if you look at the concentration of Blackness in any city, and you look at the different scales of wealth, you can see that Black people, no matter how much money they had to live together. And the problem with that was that all of the resources, once the community became rent-lined, were gone. So they no longer had access to financial capital. They could no longer develop what they probably could have if they had just different types of opportunities that were kind of taken from them because of their Blackness. And I just want to kind of reiterate the fact that even though the Fair Housing Act was passed, in order for people to take that to court and say that we're being discriminated against, the person had to prove it themselves. So it's like you had to get documentation, you had to get all of this information and then make your case to a white court with white judges and white jury. So it was just like, you're probably not gonna win. And even if you did have everything you needed, it's just like they could easily say no, and then you just wasted so much time. So that was the case for a lot of people. It was a lot of court cases that you can see people took it to court and it was the same result. And so these practices continued until it became more of a normacy, especially since the language changed, it became more coded. So everything went from de jure racism, which is like the actual implementation of you cannot have Black people in this community, to what's called de facto racism, which is the same thing except for it's a different language. They won't blatantly say it. It's not explicit anymore, but it continues to happen. Everybody who works together, who has built this system, is continuously perpetuating this system, and it just becomes normal. So I like to say that a lot of the times when you see all of these segregated communities and you see all of the hazards in these communities and you see the concentration of poverty and you see the failing schools all located in one place, is not a coincidence, and it was done on purpose to continue to perpetuate these trends. So I think we're gonna start to talk about generational wealth, which is something that I kind of focus on as I continue to do my work, because at the end of the day, the lack of ownership creates this perpetuation of poverty and lack of generational wealth. So,
And actually, could you elaborate a little bit more on the block busting? Because when we were talking earlier, that was sort of a new term, admittedly, for me, and how that related to, I mean, that's sort of a component of white flight as well.
yeah. So I can talk about white flight, and one thing that I would like to say is if you could get into a neighborhood that was not completely Black already, they would use this propaganda to kind of get people to move away. They would buy houses from white residents at a lower cost and kind of scare them out and say that your property is about to be diminished, you won't have any resources, you won't have anything, which is true. But what they would do is they would take that same property that somebody just sold and they would sell it to Black people for 3 or 4 times as much money. So that also continued to perpetuate this lack of generational wealth, because you're paying more for less. So in the Black community and maybe in other communities, this is saying that you have to do twice as much to get half as much, or, you know. So I think that that's where that stemmed from, because at every corner, it was like you had to do so much more, and then it was so many more barriers to kind of go along with that. So block busting kind of was a way for people to maintain that power, because even if you were able to kind of wiggle out and filter yourself out of the masses, you were still confronted with this fact that as soon as you get to a place where you can finally be empowered, they're going to take away everything that you need to kind of keep that going. So I think that block busting was a term that everybody should kind of get aware of, because it is just such an important part of how things can continue without the legal system kind of explicitly stating that this is how things go.
Thank you. And related to that, I think we'd also discussed about, all these practices had started to create these neighborhoods, and there are all these manifestations that still exist today. And maybe you could talk a little bit about, you had shared with us sort of the opportunities and hazards that align so closely with these red line maps if we were mapping them out today.
Yeah, so we were in conversation and I kind of explained that if you look at the map, any map in any major city, especially ones where redlining maps are available, you can see even today that those same populations of people probably still exist there. And if you look at the map and overlay that data with kind of poverty rates, with school rates, with who's dropping out, who's continuing on to get a higher education, who has access to the difference between a healthy grocery store and a corner store, or where the liquor stores are versus like all of these restaurants and shops, the lack of investment in these communities is massive, and you can easily see that if you looked at a map. It's not that difficult. You can look at a map and see where all of the good stuff is in the city and where all of the kind of dangerous stay away from that stuff is. And usually it's the difference between a white neighborhood and a Black neighborhood, or a white neighborhood or a neighborhood filled with people of color.
Thanks, Teonna. I'm going to now pass the mic over to Melinda, and she's going to continue our questioning.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Teonna is saying there. If you go to www.policymaps.com, you can start to overlay all of that information. If you go to Milwaukee or Madison or really any community, and start to see the race, the income, amount of education, access to internet, like the access to supermarkets, the list kind of goes on and on. Teonna, can you briefly talk about what role investment plays in improving, I know you mentioned generational wealth earlier, and kind of elaborate on generational wealth within Black and Brown communities?
Yeah. So I kind of like to premise this by saying that the maps that Kacie mentioned aren't that old. So I just want to say my great-grandmother died a few years ago and she was 100. So just think about how close that is to the lack of opportunity that she has with now me and my opportunity, and what that means for my children and their children, versus someone who could own 100 or 200 years ago, and then their children have that access to the good schools, to the healthy foods, to the doctors, to the internet, to all of the easy, efficient resources that they need. And think about today where the money is still going. Who's in planning and policy now? Look around at your offices, who's in leadership positions. It's not like, this major shift automatically happens. These things are continuously happening, and there's a lack of investment because there's a lack of leadership and a lack of opportunity for people who are doing the work on the grassroots level to have the same value and the same access to financial capital. So a lot of people who do work in community-based organizations and who are kind of creating this impact within Black and Brown communities to lift them up and to kind of let them know that even though all of these barriers exist, they can still kind of make moves if they wanted to. Those people are sabotaged continuously. So we looked at the redlining and the maps. It's the same for the city allocating funding to certain businesses and certain types of businesses. So like I said in my intro, I kind of worked with city planning, grassroots organizations, and then bringing different stakeholders to the table so I can see both sides of it. So like these people are doing this work on the grassroots organizers, and they go to the city and they can't get the funding allocated to their organization because they don't fit their criteria. So even it's just like really, it's a lot that goes on. And I feel like the lack of investment comes from the lack of ownership. So until we can change that, it's going to continue to perpetuate. And until ownership and the idea of ownership becomes normal in certain communities, then nothing is going to change. But it's difficult for that to become normal because it's so many barriers in the way. Like you go to school and you don't learn about ownership. You go to school and you don't, it's like, it's not there. So as much as I can, I just want to continue to enforce that that's important and that it was a reason why they didn't want people to own.
And can you talk briefly about, so I think that there's different kinds of investment, right? There's private investment, there's getting loans or business loans, there's tax dollars. What about misappropriation of funds that are meant to revitalize a community and are maybe used for an adjacent community or in the wrong way?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that kind of taps into my experience with grassroots organizing. A lot of times, like even with this City of Racine project that I just worked on, the city was going to get money from a grant that was supposed to be used to build resilience hubs in frontline communities, which are communities of color who deal with the impacts of environmental racism, because the city zones certain communities, like the redline communities, and kind of puts all of the toxic stuff in those communities. So we were trying to create an opportunity for them to have funding to kind of mitigate those. So the problem with that is that these organizations, these frontline organizers, didn't have the right type of 501c3 to get the money. So the money would have to go to a different type of organization, and that organization would then have to trickle that money down with no with no type of accountability embedded within the grant. So it was like they could just get this money, and if they wanted to share it, they could, but they didn't have to. And that happens all of the time, especially since for me, I was just kind of like, wait a minute, like we can't just skip over that. But if I wasn't there, you know what I mean? Like that conversation probably wouldn't advance. And it would have just been like, oh, okay, well, we'll just get this. but that happens all of the time, like because nobody is representing or advocating or in a position to kind of give the money out because they don't own these things, and then they can't receive the money because there's so many barriers in the way. So a lot of times they don't qualify. So with the lack of allocation, is just kind of goes back to representation and who gets to sit at the table and make these decisions.
Thank you. Adrianna, we're going to call on you next. So individual biases are another means of oppression. Could you give some examples of how biases against and biases for something have an impact?
Sure. Hey, everyone. It's important to understand that everyone has bias. Everyone experiences it. We all have different backgrounds and cultural contexts that have created hidden preferences and predispositions for or against something. Biases aren't inherently good or bad. They're just how our brains automatically categorize and put, or label situations. I come from a company called Step Up Equity Matters, and actually I've arrived to this new job, this new position, because formerly I had an employer who tried to loop me into the hiring process. And this is sort of the easy example I like to give folks on how a bias for and a bias against can really work against your greater interest. They brought me in to help direct building a diversity initiative and trying to diversify the company. But in examining their hiring process, I started to notice a very simple, easy pattern that they had a bias for people that were local. And I got that. That's a great thing. You want to bring in your community and, offer them the jobs. But when your local community is not diverse, how do you do that if it's, there's no one there to represent the diversity? And at the same time, they had a bias, against education. Where did that candidate go to school? Did they go to, say, UW-Madison, or did they go to MATC? And they, under the guise of we want the best candidate at the end of the day, they started to kind of just have a serious preference for UW-Madison's program because someone on the hiring team thought MATC did not have a strong program. And we all know that not everyone can afford UW-Madison. Certainly I could not. I went to ASU. It was a much more affordable school over in Arizona. But it happens all of the time, and it's unfair. So yeah, I'm sorry, that's my example.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Next question, kind of thinking we're kind of going in this transition if you haven't already picked up on it, and it's a lot about our history and where are we today, and where are we going forward. And the going forward question really relates to how can we begin to recognize our own personal biases, with the way the world is today.
Right. Well, we have developed a very simple model for uprooting your biases. It's 3 steps. It's about recognizing how biases create inequities, owning your biases with compassion for yourself, and disrupting your biases to foster inclusivity and equity. And so we find through a lot of our workshops that people want to go right to the disrupt. They think that it's just, what's the checklist of things I can do to immediately be someone actively doing that. And the truth is that doesn't usually lead to any effectual change. I like to think of it more as a practice like meditation than running a marathon. The more you do it, the better you get at it, and hopefully, you find your zen or your peace, or we hit diversity, equity, and inclusion. So step 1, recognizing that biases are a normal part of the human experience. Bias is part of our fundamental survival mechanism. For example, you come up to a stove and you don't know if it's hot or cold, so you touch it real lightly, but you'll always do that just in case. That's keeping you safe so that you don't do that. So if we understand this concept, you can just find the compassion in yourselves to start doing the work. And so once you own responsibility, as opposed to just feeling guilty, because we know guilty feelings lead to defensiveness and blaming, whereas responsibility really empowers you to make the changes that lead to becoming the person that you want to be. And then disrupting, it just involves paying attention, slowing down and looking at what's happening around you. You have the opportunity to distinguish between an event and your interpretation of that event. Really take the time. And is it what's happening, or is it my bias that makes me feel this way? And then also get out of your comfort zone. So explore people, circumstances, all the things that make you feel awkward and uneasy, because those moments can teach a lot about yourself. And just ask the questions like, what am I reacting to? Is it really what's happening? Does this happen regularly? Do I often feel like this? And really it's a muscle. So the more you do it, the more strong and how quick your reactions will change, probably for the better. So we have an entire online challenge should you want to actually deep dive into your own personal biases, because the truth is, you know, in a crazy world that we all feel like we can't control anything. The only thing we can control is ourselves. So doing the work on yourselves, you can start at stepupforequity.com, and it's a 9-day challenge. So we also know that the prolonged exposure to it tends to let it set in a little better on how to do it effectively.
I was going to say 2 steps seems way too easy. There's got to be more.
That's why it's 3.
So, okay, recognize bias, disrupting, and what's step 3?
It's recognize it first, own it. You got to own it. Then you disrupt it. If you just try to disrupt it without pretending you didn't see it and you didn't own it, it's not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. We can all go through this process, I hope, this year of all years.
I hope so. I think that by everyone showing up and giving a damn, if excuse my language, is a start.
Yeah, do you have your card available you can show us?
Oh, yeah, sorry, you're right. Yes, sorry. Choose your adventure, everyone. Anyway.
All right, final question. Yeah. We have no children on the line.
I saw one baby, but I don't know if it can read yet.
Yeah, that's good. So for all of our panelists, I think, again, we're going to go in breakout rooms after this question, but this is just to kind of give our participants some food for thought. So to all of you, could you highlight some organizations which are pushing for change? So I know we talked about these as we talked as a group, but if you want to share some of those with the group now, that would be great.
Okay, I'll start. So I definitely want to give a shout out to Dr. Arijit Sen, who actually works at UW-Milwaukee in architecture department. And he runs this program called the Buildings, Landscapes, Cultures Field School. And he collaborates with the Humanities Action Lab. He collaborates with all of these grassroots organizations in the Washington Park community and Sherman Park community and Milwaukee. He just collaborates with everybody who's doing anything to work towards progress. And so definitely get with him, because his methods are just the best that you could ever get. I also want to shout out Michael Ford, Hip Hop Architecture Camps. If you haven't heard of that, you just need to get with it, because that's the really, I was about to say dope, but I don't know. It's really good program. Pascal Sablan, Beyond the Built organization, it's a nonprofit, and she basically highlights minority architects, planners, engineers, people in design from all over the world, and gives them a platform to kind of share their work and elevate them in that way with galleries, exhibitions, all of these beautiful things. The NOMA organization, National Organization of Minority Architects, and the student chapters, the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students. I was involved with both of them, and they're beautiful organizations. They have chapters in almost every state, and so you can easily find one and support however you can. I'll pass it along, so I won't just take up the 400 word. I just want to mention that too, Tiffany Brown. You guys could go.
No, I think that's great. That's actually a great list. I just wanted to say I was really impressed. I didn't know much about NOMA, and I love that the tagline is all in. So just talking with Marion in my office, it's not about race necessarily. Sometimes minority architect could be the only woman or the only architect in the community or whatever. So it's a really cool message.
Definitely. And I'm also a part of the Wisconsin NOMA chapter, Westco NOMA. So we're just starting out, but yeah, we're growing because we're connecting with other NOMA chapters. So I just wanted to shout us out just in case Walter Wilson, I see you on the phone. He's the first president of it. no longer president right now, but yeah, okay. I'm done.
I can go next. I think if you're looking for organizations to support, you should really think about what you're trying to accomplish. Like what's the end goal for you? And there's always some intersection. So like Teonna talked about, like these histories, redlining and racial covenants and segregation, all affect something else today. So like I always tell people, find whatever that passion is or that issue is for you, and then find the organization for that. So like, for example, my husband works in medicine, and so he is part of White Coats for Black Lives, which has chapters all across the US, and it's about how white doctors can step up and support Black Lives Matter, and how doctors can enact some of the changes they want to see and be anti-racist in their medical profession, right? If you're interested in housing and in housing history and about knowing more about your neighborhood, there are lots of local history projects that do that type of history. So in Minneapolis, actually the only city that knows every single racial covenant and where it's located is Minneapolis, because there is an organization called Mapping Prejudice, which mapped every single racial covenant in the city. And they are now expanding to St. Paul, and then they're hoping to actually find another city in the Midwest to come to. So I know that they're looking at like Milwaukee and Madison as options. But there's things for everything. So like the intersection of this history goes far and wide. So if education is something that is important to you, there are education initiatives and organizations that work on racial justice in education. If something that's important to you is police and figuring out how this history aligns with which neighborhoods are policed and which ones are not, there are lots of organizations doing this kind of social justice work around police and around police brutality in our neighborhoods. And so that has always been helpful for me, is finding that intersection of what you're passionate about and where that intersects with anti-racism, because you're way more likely to stick on the journey and to support and to really follow along if you're passionate about the issue and what it brings up for you. And so those are just like a couple ideas that I have about how you can kind of find that organization that matters to you. And so once you kind of know those things, it's really easy to just do like an internet search and like look up like racism education organization, and like they come up in your neighborhoods, because a lot of people want to support, I think, the national organizations like the NAACP or the ACLU, and those are great, but there are grassroots people in your neighborhood who would die to have $100 to go towards, you know, their organization, because they don't get the same kind of press that the NAACP does. They don't get the same press that ACLU does. And so often, you know, when I give to a big organization like ACLU, I find the local one and give more to them, because it's so important to make sure that you're supporting those grassroots people, because your money goes a lot further and you know it impacts your own community. That would be like my elevator pitch.
Thank you, Kacie.
I would just provide you Kacie's email address and Teonna's email address, and it seems like they may know everything there ever was to know. So that's my input. Otherwise, if locally you're looking for, excuse the plug, but Step Up, we do workshops and we do consulting, and we are actually working on a online course for essentially training trainers for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So trying to cast the net far and wide and not just do the work ourselves, but teach people how to do the work. So that should be coming soon.
Can you share your app with us briefly?
Oh, and recently I created, it was on the heels of the protests, and the quick story of it is that I, you know, in times of COVID-19, it was a little bit scary for me to be out in the streets with everybody, except my heart was certainly with them. So all I could do from my home was, you know, use the internet. And I created an app to compile a lot of the resources that had been being disseminated online, that were like Google Docs and a long list of text links that I found just a little bit from a user experience perspective, very difficult to follow and use. So I just created an app. So if you go to yourblackfriendsarebusy.com, it's a resource that you can put on your phone or use on your desktop, just to help you organize your educational efforts.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Anytime.
Nice. I just like to share one more. I put something in a chat. I call it the Black Designers Resource. It's actually called the Anti-Racism Design Resources, but it's a database that a bunch of architects and planners got together and created. It's a long list of organizations who do equity work, organizations who are providing pro bono services, organizations that are doing all of these workshops and conversations and panel discussions. So if you want to continue to get involved, definitely check that link out because it's just a huge database of just opportunities. So.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a great resource. I was like driving through it as fast as I could after she sent it last week. I am definitely in the step 2 of the 3-step process, and just, you know, a sponge. And I think that's all you really can do. And so I have a couple good books that I would like to recommend. I started with The Color of Law. I don't have a slide for this one. Sorry. This is recommended by Therese. The Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram. And he also has a couple good talks out there right now that he's either moderated or been a panelist for. And The White Fragility, I think that's the one that right now I'm reading, and it's just ringing true in a lot of ways. And I see that there's a lot of good resources in the chat, so please take advantage of that. We'll try to collect those and share after the event, because we've obviously had a lot of great discussion, and we'll share all of these resources with the people that have registered for the event. So if we'd like to break you into small groups next to discuss how you can make changes in our cities. We hope you can leverage what you heard from our panelists as we learn from each other in our small groups. We will provide some questions to help start the discussion, but don't feel you have to answer each one. The goal of the discussion is to identify actionable strategies to make change. If 2 or 3 actions, please have a group member write them in the chat box. And when you write them in the chat box, you'll break into rooms. So Zoom will like automatically put you in a little virtual chat room with a few people. And you can still chat back to everyone. So just make sure that when you chat, it says everyone instead of just a private chat. And Teresa and I will collect your summaries and your reports, and then we'll get back together to discuss the action plans. So I'm gonna quickly share.
Marianne, can I pick on you? Can you share what you guys discussed in your quick 15 minutes?
We got to question number 1.
Start.
Yeah, we talked about how can design unite, and we talked about design has the ability to engage people. Ever talked about, you know, it's a process of iterations and getting input and feedback and coming back again and fine tuning. And Walter shared one process that he has to get, and what's the word, Adrianna?
Power of 10?
Yes, power of 10, but you said he had to have it.
Trademarked.
Trademarked, yes. So in designing and placemaking, he thinks, he always looks at providing 10 points in the way that design touches different aspects. The design has to touch 10 different aspects of, or engage 10 ways of solving the problem. It can talk about, you know, community, design strategy, doesn't alienate a person. And so that way, when you're thinking through a design, you're actually making sure that it solves the problems of many and not being myopic. And it that way has a broader reach. And that way it has the opportunity for engagement and uniting people in a broader way. And we know that we do that as designers, or you talk about having meetings with stakeholders and having people in the room. I gave the example of healthcare. You can have departments, operational, the financial stakeholders, patients, families. But if we look at that in terms of a broader perspective, and any way that we reach out to solve individual problems, and making sure, again, like Teonna was mentioning, having the people at the table to have the different perspectives heard in order to come to a solution. That way design can help to have a broader reach and have a more stronger way of coming to an answer.
Thanks, Marianne. I'm going to try my best to take a few notes just so that people have a record of what we talked about during this time. Did anybody else want to offer what they discussed about that first question, or any of the questions? If you put anything in the chat, it didn't come through. So we're sort of reaching now. We're hoping that people are willing to sort of speak up and turn their mic off and share what you discussed.
I think we went off topic a little bit. I see a lot of faculty members here in this call today, and I was curious how how architectural education can play a role in creating this awareness. We definitely know that all of this plays into into our community and into our cities. So are there ways that architectural education can address some of this so that when we come out of school, we have some awareness or some direction?
This is Carolyn. I was saying in my group, besides coursework, but also the design center that I'm the director of community design solutions. The feedback I've gotten from students is they really appreciate being in the neighborhood, working with clients they wouldn't normally work with, working on projects. They're facilitating public input meetings sometimes. So I think the connection to real projects and going to projects that are in neighborhoods they wouldn't normally be comfortable with. That's the feedback I've received for them afterwards, is they really appreciated that experience and they wouldn't have done that on their own. And so they had a different perspective going into the firms that they're working in now and being comfortable. So hands-on.
Yeah, I might add, this is Mo. One of the interesting things, we have a faculty fellow. I don't think I saw Sarah Aziz on the call, but she is coordinating our sophomore level studio, and I'd be curious to see in a couple of years what these students are like as they enter the profession, because their assignment has been to walk the boundary of Milwaukee. And it's been a really interesting experience, both to get out and slowly observe, as I think in any discipline related to design field, but observe our community and getting out there in terms of really experiencing it. And so it's been a really fun opportunity to parallel that. I'm teaching graduate students and we're doing the same assignment, getting out and walking the city, but it's been spectacular.
And I guess in the Marcus Price Studio, isn't there site in historic Mitchell?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot going on at the school relative to this. Marcus Prize, I know Trudy's on the call and she's deeply involved in similar work. And I think, Trudy, if you want to speak to that, but I think there is a lot of work to be done at the school in terms of the faculty around DEI issues, anti-racism issues, that we are trying to tackle it. I think like most places on a slow, more reflective level, as opposed to jumping in and trying to come up with the solution. I think it's a lot of reflection, and I'm not sure we're even at step 2 relative to Adrianna's comment earlier, but we're working on it. I would say, I think like all of us and across the discipline and the profession.
I would like to suggest that we pay more attention to expanding the imaginations of our design community. I think right now there's an opportunity within the university to focus on developing our imaginations to think beyond just the usual and imagine beyond what would be typical, colloquial, or our universe as we envision it right now, and go beyond that. I'm struggling with how to explain it, but there's a very interesting book called Imagination First, which delves into ways to teach how to imagine beyond what our natural thinking is about what imagination is. So that I'd like to add that.
As a non-academic person, my name's Amanda. I live and work in Milwaukee. I'm not affiliated with any of the Wisconsin higher education organizations in the state, but I work for an affordable housing developer, a nonprofit out of Boston, and I work on projects in 14 different states. And I think one of the things that would have benefited me greatly as an interior designer in design school, and perhaps, well, not perhaps, I feel strongly would benefit students of architecture as well, is to provide resources in terms of who are the designers and the professionals of color in your community. And when you're talking about working with a new community in terms of developing housing or some community resource, as opposed to just a private development, to learn to put the voices of the people your project is serving first. So if you are working on increasing diversity, inclusion, and equity within your departments, ask maybe people of color what they need. And forgive me, I don't mean to be insulting and assume that you're not doing this. I just don't know anything about the academic world in Wisconsin. But asking people of color what would benefit them and what would bring strength to your program would be place number one to start. And then we were having a conversation in our group about affordable housing itself and the variations within that industry, and how it's challenging sometimes to step outside of our developers bubble and recognize that everything we do has to be centered around the resident. And so you could broadly say everything you do on a project has to be centered around the client's needs. And it can't be paternalistic. We can't say, this is what you need. This is what we understand your market segment needs. But what do you, as a single unique population, what do you need? Who can speak for you? Who can advocate with us? And how do we get that information so that we can give you what you want, as opposed to what is easily funded or looks flashy? So that's what I got.
I mean, I'd love to chime in just since we're on the topic of education. Being on the faculty at SARUP, I feel it's not only about listening to people better, but actually making our discipline more inclusive. So we're the profession of architecture is just over 60% white in the country, only 2% African American. That's ridiculous. And what that means is that there aren't more BIPOC people coming through architecture school. So I think in addition to sort of, ensuring that existing architects are more capable of serving neighborhoods, we have to change architecture education so that it's more available and accessible to a broader array of people. So from my perspective, that takes a huge transformation in things like studio culture, the value of our labor, and things like that are like really big, gnarly issues to begin opening up. So not only serving more diverse communities, but actually fundamentally changing the way we deliver education so that architecture school is survivable and thrivable by more people.
I would totally second that, Trudy. I was thinking of, somebody mentioned Pascal Sablon earlier, and her work in partnership with NOMA, the national group, and various state chapters in getting exhibits going called Beyond the Built Environment. She was able to do an exhibit in Chicago for the Illinois chapter, and I wanted to get something set up in Wisconsin, but I don't have local contacts except for the people I meet on these calls. And so I think that doing that kind of exhibit of who are the diverse professionals and women who are doing architecture and design in this state, can we feature them? Can we feature their work? Can we get this exhibit in a place where kids will see it? They have, she's developed training sessions, week-long training sessions for kids who are interested in learning architecture. And if you can start building that exposure at that young age, junior high, high school level, you will start to see increases in the pipeline of kids going and pursuing architecture degrees and design degrees. That's sort of the highest upstream strategy for increasing numbers and opening up both of our industries for more diverse voices at the table. But it's incredibly powerful, and she can do these exhibits on a shoestring. So if anybody wants to talk more about that at any point, I urge you to either contact Sablon or Pascal directly, or contact me. and we can talk, because I would love to see something like this in Wisconsin. I think the value is tremendous.
Wait, I was curious if just as a tangent off of that topic, knowing that the exposure of an architecture and design education at an earlier age would potentially help to inspire greater diversity in the profession for future years. Clinton, who's on this call, I mean, she came to us, she was a very, very ambitious student who wanted to study architecture. And I'm curious if she has any thoughts on, how she was even exposed to the profession and from her experience, being a high school student, and perhaps that interest was sparked at a younger age, if ever wanted to chime in. I'm not sure if she's still on the call, but.
I'm still here. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Angela. So I decided that I wanted to be an architect because my brother decided he wanted to be one. And so I love my siblings and I just follow them wherever they go. But then I was involved with the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Milwaukee. And so because we were in the Stein Scholars Program, which is a pre-college program, we started sophomore year in high school at Mesmer. At least that's how I started. They literally asked me, what do you want to do? Because we can get internships for you. And I said, well, I want to be an architect. And then we had to go through some weird etiquette courses, which, we can have a conversation about that later. But then they connected us, the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Milwaukee connected me with workshop architects through one of the grants through the Milwaukee government. And I forgot the names of that grant, but I could do some soul searching and figure it out and put it in the chat. But as soon as I graduated high school, I got an internship with workshop architects. And I hadn't had no type of experience in architecture. I didn't know where to start, didn't know where to look, but they did a really good job at getting me into some of the projects, some of the things that I should be thinking about before I enter university level. So I had quite a bit of professional experience before I had actually went to UWM. So that was really beneficial. But just from my story, and you were talking about how you could get involved and connect people of color and put their projects on the map. I would just encourage you to one thing that helps me get into speaking with communities I don't know much about is just actually going to their community hosted events, getting to know them as people first before you start to ask them to engage in emotional labor with them. And so just around Milwaukee in general, there's a lot of community projects going on, and not just projects hosted by architects or people of design, but people who live in the community as well. So they may have things going on, and as soon as you get connected with them, then that's how you sort of start to build a relationship so that you can be connected with the grassroots community along with the people of design, because UWM designers, people in the university field, that's a whole different context than the people that we want to serve in our physical environments. And so getting into those community and actually just getting to know them as people is one way to start to get to know what they need, who can they speak to, because 9 times out of 10, they're already doing the work. It's really important to recognize that they're doing the work already. So yeah, I don't know. I think I just rambled.
No, I think that's a great message. Thank you for sharing that. I think
it's talking about the ACE mentorship program as being another great tool for raising awareness and in areas where they might not have much exposure to architecture as a profession or the design industry. And maybe in our breakout group, somebody brought up a good point that if you don't see people like yourself in the profession, then you're not inclined to go into the profession. So maybe it's up to, us minority architects to get ourselves out there and to go to programs such as, in the high schools or in and make high schoolers aware that there is a place, you know, in every profession for everybody, and that there should not be that hesitation.
It's really been kind of an interesting conversation to put this into, and this is probably simplifying it too much, but to put this into buckets. So it's kind of the education piece, right? And the professional piece and maybe the personal piece. Is there any examples that anyone was willing to share about, you know, you're an architect, you get a job, and how do you put a lens on that based on your personal experience? If you're in the step 2 of the own it, you know, you own your biases, you understand that they're there. Has there been a project, anyone on the phone, that you've just tweaked it somehow, or put a different lens, or opened your group up to kind of understand a different way to do it, or chose a project because of a specific reason? No, nobody. I think it's an interesting example, and I think Teonna mentioned it earlier, was 400 Forward. So if you, I think it's on Hulu, it's a documentary, it's called Design for All, and she's featured in it. And what's interesting is that there's, like, someone mentioned earlier that females make up 20% and African Americans make up less, but Black female architects, it's 0.3% of registered architects. So it's when the 400th Black female architect became licensed, that's when the group's name kind of started off of that. Yeah, thank you, Teonna, for putting that in the chat. I think it's really interesting. And there's groups like Girls Inc. In Madison that try to bring girls of color into professions related to STEM. So obviously one of those things is architecture, along with, you know, the other things in Madison, which is tech, right? Anyone else want to share what their group talked about?
Our group ended up talking a lot about policies and things that are currently happening that we can see but don't understand why they are the way they are. And so things like transportation being a key connection and such an important element in the workforce and in the mobility of residents being able to get to and from jobs. Things like, you know, driving around the city and noticing that there's some streets that are definitely getting more paved, or paved more frequently than others in different neighborhoods, or sidewalks that are being repaired more often and or more frequently than other neighborhoods. And so we were kind of talking about how do we, or just, I guess one of the things that came up was just even maintenance, you know, like even when you can find the funds to do a streetscaping project, there isn't the funds to maintain them. So, you know, even when you do a nice intersection paving strategy, when the road needs to be repaired, asphalt just gets slapped on it. And how do we change those systemic policy items so that it's not necessarily perpetuating some of the stereotypes of some neighborhoods? We didn't have an answer, but that's what we talked about.
Thanks for sharing.
I think something else that was, unfortunately, I was cut off right at the tail end of a statement was certain policies that are in place for urban developments. And one thing that I've noticed that I'm not familiar with what the policies are for development in Milwaukee, but in San Diego, when there were new developments being proposed or implemented, a number of units were mandated by the city to be affordable housing. So, you know, you essentially, you had mixed use developments that were, instead of just some being having availability for affordable housing, all of the new developments had affordable housing. So it just became the norm of building in the city, which again, I'm not sure if that's the practice for policy in Milwaukee, but, you know, is that something that could be potentially inspired for our city?
I just like to say, with my research in housing, I know that that's something that happens in multiple places. And one of the things that got me interested in urban planning was the fact that you could take all of these failing policies and practices and put it anywhere else and see that the same thing exists. And then not only does it happen in the US, but it's a global thing. And it might look different in different places, but the results are still the same and the intentions were the same. So I think that somebody asked what's next. And I think that before anybody leaves the conversation, there's the app that you can kind of engage with to kind of understand where you are, but just pay more attention. I think once you start to acknowledge and reflect on how you think and how you move, you'll start to notice things in a different way. And that's what a lot of people like to call woke. But once you get woke, it's like you can't unsee things. Things aren't going to fly over your head anymore because you're going to be acknowledging that this is connected to this and this and this. So I think get woke, y'all. Just get woke. You know, just do it. Just do your work. And then let's have these conversations.
What's the hashtag from this, by the way? Get woke. I think that's been one of the most enlightening discussions that I've had about this entire topic, which I can't even call this a topic because this is like life, here, but is about not, everyone says I'm not racist, right? I'm not whatever. But the second that you say that, you're not recognizing your own bias. So to Adrianna's point, recognizing that you have to, you can't be idle, right? You have to get woke.
Oh, one more thing before we leave, just to dovetail off of what both Melinda and Teonna was talking about. One way to sort of then help people sort of look at themselves is to just really be honest about how you contribute to these systematic things put in place that oppress different people. And I'm not talking about always approaching it from a very systemic, point of view, what does the university do? What does the school do? Or anything like that, but more of how have I participated in this? What have I done? And then also look at, the stereotypes that you intentionally and unintentionally place on other people and be honest about that. Because once you start to reinscribe those types of stereotypes that you put on communities that you want to help, then you start to engage an identity that has nothing to do with the people who actually need the help. It has everything to do with what you envisioned that what they needed in the first place. And so I'd admonish you to just sort of when you're looking and taking a reflection, it's gonna hurt, but you still just have to do it anyways.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. Somewhere in here in the chat, there's a YouTube video that I posted, and it's a lecture with several panelists. One of them is Dr. Ibram. And if you go to around 33 minutes, so you don't have to listen, it's an hour, you don't have to listen to the whole hour, but it's about this perception of dangerous Black neighborhoods. And he summarizes it in 2 minutes, and it's so on point for what's going on today, and this perception of danger and race coupled together. And so I encourage all of you to scroll back and find that YouTube video somewhere and only watch around. It's 33:40, I think, is when he starts talking about it. And it's super interesting.
Can I also add a plug before we sign off? Last week, 2 weeks ago, I guess it was last week, the ASID, the American Society of Interior Designers, had their virtual conference, first virtual conference, which ran for about 3 days. One of the sessions I was honored to participate in was called Housing, Design, and Social Justice. And it was a fascinating hour-long conversation. And I say fascinating because I was involved in it, but also because the panelists were outstanding, and they have a national view on affordable housing and social justice, on unaffordable housing as well. Sorry, not just affordable housing. And so issues of social justice and how design can and perhaps should impact those topics. If y'all want to, I think that if you just go to the ASID's general website, they're going to be making videos available, recordings available of that session. And it may help if you're looking to kind of further your thinking or explore a little bit as you're learning. I found it tremendously beneficial.
There's also, while we're plugging conferences, there's also a fantastic conference happening this week. The Association for Community Design is partnering with Next City and Spaces and Traces, and there's a lot of topics and discussions happening around this type of conversation, as well as just equity issues and design. ACD, the conference is $20 to go to have access to all of their sessions for the week, and they're doing some fantastic programming. So definitely check that out too this week.
I think one of the last things that I would love to maybe help us all bring this to a close is to think about, you know, there are a lot of conversations that are happening around this. What's the action? What are we doing? You know, like, again, like there's a lot of talk about it, which I think is good, but, you know, at the end of it, what can we do? And, you know, I think it would be really cool if, you know, somehow we were somehow able to, you know, at the end of this, be able to come up with a list, even if it's just 10 things, you know, 10 things that we can do, whether that's right now or tomorrow or this weekend, just something that we can do to really help move this topic forward and start affecting change.
Is there a chance that we could make this some kind of regular meeting for those who are interested?
I think Angela, you are like speaking exactly to what Therese and Alexis and I, you know, started organizing this event, and that's exactly what we wanted. And I think we hoped that the breakout rooms would be a start to that discussion, and we hope that it can go further, but it's, you know, what's talk, right? So I would be curious if anyone on the phone has an idea of an actionable item, right? Because that's what we want to get out of this. We had great discussion, and we heard a lot about historical perspective and where we are today and where are we going, and a lot of great organizations to look to. But that's what we're curious about, because it's, I think, where we're a little stuck is what's next.
Yeah, I have some ideas. So I think that the easiest thing that you can do, the most painless thing that you can do, is elevate people's work who already do this. Definitely promote them, donate to them when possible, connect with them, see how you can help, find ways to get involved, educate yourself, educate the people around you, start having uncomfortable conversations and get comfortable with that. I think that's the first thing you can do. And once you kind of get a foundation for yourself and you get your connections going, then, you know, I can't do that work for you because I'm doing a lot of work. You can connect with me and we can see how we can co-create. But I think that it really depends on how your kind of connections and expertise kind of can work towards progress. You have to figure that out, and you can't just do that without laying any type of foundation. But yeah.
Well, hopefully we can all, at the end of the day, and at the end of this conversation, and somewhere into the near future, you know, be able to come back and say, you know, this is what I did. And Apina, you brought up a really cool idea, and I'll definitely connect with you offline on an idea that I have that could, again, maybe help inspire the exposure of architecture education to younger learners.
I have a recommendation, and it's from experience. When they brought me on to work on the diversity of hiring at my company, you know, one thing is for me to suggest and everything, but they did not empower me to make any changes. So although we had a new action list, but with no authority to actually make it happen, it was worthless. And so, I mean, I left right around the time they had asked me to do that. So literally nothing got done. So if you are in a position of power and you are creating teams, make sure those teams have the power to make the changes.
Can I add something too? I would also add that, like, I think I often get bogged down in, like, I want things to change right now. Like, we need to push harder. We need to make this change right now. And this, like, anti-racism fight is not, it's like our whole lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children and our children's children. And if there is a United States or a planet Earth after that, it will be their responsibility as well. And so figuring out what your sphere of influence is and what you can change and what you're empowered to change, and changing that, even if it's really small, even if it's tiny, even if it's just like finally getting your racist uncle to stop saying racist things at the Thanksgiving dinner table for like 2 years in a row. Like, these are things that like matter, even if they seem small and inconsequential. And every single tiny action, if we all took them, would we still be having all these conversations, right? Probably not, because we'd be in a different place. And so it doesn't need to feel overwhelming, because I think it can feel overwhelming. This is a lifelong fight, both for us as individuals and also in the actions that we need to take. And change doesn't always appear really quickly. And so we have to kind of keep in mind that like we're carrying this torch for a really long time.
Well, this has really been a wonderful discussion, and I want to thank everybody for chiming in and sharing your thoughts. There have been a ton of awesome recommendations and links shared. There's a lot in the chats. There have been a lot that people have shared on their videos. We will try to do our best to compile all of the links and resources that have been shared and send those out to everyone who registered for this meeting afterwards, so you should be able to find what you're looking for. We wanted to just also quick highlight Alexis. I don't know where you are, but
I'm here.
Oh, great. There you are. So
Yeah.
Alexis is part of Women in Design Milwaukee, and she has put together WIDS. Would you want to tell us a little bit about that real quickly?
Yeah, so it's Women in Design for Students, and we started out with SERUP students, but we also invited other students from various universities in Milwaukee and other departments within UWM. So yeah, and right now we're just trying to connect with students to get them to come to the Women in Design events, but we will be starting some of our own events next semester. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. We're super excited to have students get involved in the Women in Design events and engage more with the academic girls in architecture. So I really appreciate you introducing them. Lastly, I just want to give just a quick introduction to next month's event. So our October event is called Empowering Architecture, Art, and Design with XR, Present and Future. So extended reality is a concept that encompasses the area of virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and this talk seeks to offer an overview of the potential of XR to enrich the visualization processes, the stimulation of perception and collaborative design, and revealing how this is changing our present and its impact on the future. So the date is October 13th, 5:30 to 7 p.m. This will be a virtual event. You can register on our website, and we should have that registration up for you tomorrow. So keep an eye out. We will be sending out more information on this event shortly.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I think Teonna and Kacie have posted their email. I think Adrianna, you did earlier as well. So, you know, virtual clap for all of you. It's unfortunate we can't all be in person because, you know, that's such a great part of these events. And we just really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us tonight and talk about this topic.